All right, well, we'll give attendees, we've got one, well, more coming in. So we'll give it about a minute or two for people to sign in. And then we'll get underway. And attendees, I think there is a way, is there not, for you to raise your hand if you'd like to add a comment at any point. So do that and I will let you in and you can add to the discussion. We'll wait until we have a few more people and then get started. Here's Kyle.
Kyle, you look very good on camera.
Well, that's kind of you to say. I got too ambitious with a run this afternoon. I'm off of work, so I was like, well, maybe I can squeeze in a little run down to Wash Park and back and get in a good 15 miles. And I overestimated my speed badly and cut that way too close. So.
I'm going to give it until 5:03 and then we'll start. We've got so far 8 of the 30 or so people who signed up to, or registered to take part. So they maybe they're all on a run. Who knows?
I'm seeing 14 participants.
Oh, you are?
Yeah. Well,
Oh.
8 and 6.
That's us too.
6 of us. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to get started because we probably have a lot of ground to cover. And I'd like to welcome those of you who are in the meeting so far to Ethics Week 2023. This is, as I recall, the 25th annual. It started in April 1919 after SPJ had been doing Sunshine Week for a while. And we figured, why not pay as much attention to our other primary mission as we do to freedom of information and open government? And it is one of the principal missions of the society. And I think it may be the one for which we're best known, because the other journalism organizations tend to focus more on things like professional development, reporting to get to the things that people are trying to keep secret. And of course, that's one of the most ethical things you can do, is that kind of reporting. But we go beyond that to say that, remind journalists that it's not necessarily to always focus on what's wrong. There is actual news out there that could give people reason to hope instead of to be hostile. The Code of Ethics itself is a media standard. It's been around since 1926, I believe, 17 years after SPJ started. It has been amended, I think, 7 times, most recently in 2014. but it hasn't changed a lot in its last two iterations. The Ethics Week was originally included grants to local chapters for their own programs, and more recently, it's had more of a national focus. I should point out that it may be actually having an effect, as Rod pointed out in a memo to the rest of us this morning. This is the day that both Tucker Carlson and Don Lemon were let go for what could have been considered ethical violations. So maybe this served as a catalyst, although I kind of doubt it. We haven't always had a theme for Ethics Week, but recent events have given us an opportunity to do that. And we're kind of focusing on trust this year. You'll hear a lot of discussion this week about how the public has lost trust in traditional sources and what can be done to restore that. We're also still getting revelations like what happened today that are reverberating from the Dominion lawsuit against Fox News, which showed the hypocrisy of pandering to your audience instead of being really faithful to the truth. So at this opening program, we're going to talk about trusted sources, which is Don Colosino's documentary that he previewed to an overflow crowd at SPJ's National Convention in Washington, D.C. last October. And then on Wednesday, we'll hear from three panelists, Lynn Walsh, Sally Lehrman, and Beth Potter, all of whom are prominent at SPJ and all are working in prominent roles on trust-related projects. You'll see it, at least you'll see some of this in Don's clips that he's going to show. There's also a strong connection between their work and what SPJ has done from its beginning and continues to do now and into the future about trust. And it's called Trust, Truth, and SPJ, and will begin at the same time as all of the other sessions, 7 p.m. It's on Wednesday, 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, 5 p.m. Mountain, 4 p.m. Pacific, and because one of our members of the Ethics Committee is in Hong Kong, for him it's 7 a.m. the following day. On Thursday, our Hong Kong member will lead a discussion on the effects that generative artificial intelligence tools, such as ChatGPT, how they can be used by journalists and what some of the pitfalls may be. They're good for research, but for writing, maybe not so much. There will be three panelists there. I think one is still in the works, but Amy Reinhart and Joe Amditis will be the other two. And our final session on Saturday, April 29th, will be an open forum where people who have questions about the ethics code, who have ethical problems that they'd like to discuss, can take them to committee members who will be in that webinar, and we'll spend an hour to an hour and a half talking through those issues. We're thinking of making this an annual feature. So now, Rod, do you have anything to add about SPJ's history? Maybe something about Ethics Central would be useful at this point. You're on mute, I think.
Thanks, Fred. I'm Rod Hicks. I'm the Director of Ethics and Diversity at SPJ. And what I do, one of the things that I do is I take questions from journalists, often on deadline, about ethical issues going on in their newsrooms, and they want some guidance about that. So you can just call us up. There's a form on the website that you can fill out and just ask your ethical questions. And usually it's just me, but sometimes I consult with Fred, and sometimes we even consult with the entire committee for some of the questions. And we do get some good ones in there. And it just amazes me how many issues come up and how diverse those issues are. One of the tools that we have, or one of the resources that we have for journalists, is a page called Ethics Central. And this is a place where we try to keep up with news that's going on in journalism that deal with ethics. There's also a diversity section to it as well. We also on this page, if you can call that up, Kim, we also on this page have a section where we talk about issues that have cropped up in newsrooms, and we have a story. The SPJ Code of Ethics is there, and there are tips every day on how you could integrate each of the, I think, 35 bullet points from the Code of Ethics to help improve trust of your news organization. So that's one of the primary resources that we have there. We also have some others. There are some case studies that you can find on the website of Ethical Issues. And there is a journalist toolbox that it covers a lot of things, including issues of ethics. The journalist toolbox is actually curated by someone outside of SPJ, but it lives on our website. And it's a very rich resource for lots of things. Whatever the issue is, there's a school shooting. You can go to the page and you get resources about covering school shootings. The abortion ruling, you can go and find resources about that. So just take a look at it when you get a chance.
Thank you, Rod. One more thing. There's a book. It's also online. It's called Media Ethics, and it has a lot of case studies in it and a lot of excerpts from news organizations' codes of ethics arranged by topic. So if you're writing a code of ethics for yourself or your organization, you can find a good resource there. Well, let me introduce the rest of the panel. Kyle Clark, who is currently DARC, is a nightly news anchor at 9 News in Denver and managing editor of a very innovative show called Next with Kyle Clark, a 6 p.m. broadcast that has won 4 Edward R. Murrow Awards. And it emphasizes analytical and solutions inclusive reporting. It's I think where journalism is probably headed and needs to head if it's to continue to thrive and survive. Kyle's gained some national attention for his efforts in particular to encourage journalists to be more straightforward in confronting sources who are loose with the truth. I think it's because of perhaps one of our members of Congress who is prone to not being totally accurate all the time. He also has won more than 20 Emmys. Don Colosino, who will be showing us excerpts from his feature-length documentary entitled Trusted Sources, is based here in Colorado, where I am. And his documentary is about people working to reverse the decline of trust in news. And his documentary is being produced in partnership with SPJ, and it should be ready for nationwide release in a year from now in the spring of 2024. Meredith Jordan is the executive director of Press or Media, Public Alliance of Professional Journalists, which is working toward the voluntary self-credentialing of journalists. She spent 25 years working for East Coast news organizations before moving to the West Coast to cover the movie industry. Her most recent book is Top Gun Memos, The Making and Legacy of an Iconic Movie. And Rod, you've already met. He's SPJ's Director of Ethics and Diversity. He joined the national staff in July 2019 with the title then of Journalist on Call. He's based in Philadelphia, but travels extensively, speaking and advising and informing helping journalists understand why they've lost trust, and helping the public understand what it is that journalists are trying to do. He is a veteran journalist himself, having worked as a reporter and editor for the Associated Press, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the Detroit News, also active in the National Association of Black Journalists, and has taught at Talladega College and the University of Alabama. So I think we're ready to start. And I would encourage you, if you would like to join in the conversation, to use your hand raising capacity on your screen. And I will try to keep an eye on who's doing what. And Don and I are going to show, mostly Don, he knows how it works better than I do, are going to show some brief clips from his documentary, followed by commentary from the panelists. And you will have a chance to comment too. So, Don, you want to start with your first brief clip?
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to set this up and just sort of talk about what's in the film or what's going to be in the film. I'm still in production, so what you're seeing is are some clips as I go. You know, it's almost raw footage. I've prettied it up just a little bit, but it's not what you'll see on the big screen when this is finished. But in the film, I follow people who have misperceptions about news. And through their eyes, I examine the reasons for mistrust. And they range from things like just misunderstandings about ethics and how journalism operates, misperceptions of bias when newscasts or news reports perhaps contradict their own beliefs, their personal beliefs, to things like a lack of diversity and not portraying, communities, the way the people in those communities have experienced have their lived experience. I didn't say that well, but anyway, the first clip that I'm going to show you is about just that very issue of perceptions of bias. And I'll just let it play, and then we'll talk about things a little bit, I guess, Fred, and then encourage questions from the audience. So here is the first clip.
I think one of the challenges that the news industry faces right now is that there is a perception that
We lost the audio, Don.
Yeah, we did.
they're not telling the truth.
Instead of journalists.
Is that better?
Agenda, and that it's probably a liberal agenda.
Yeah, we
Okay.
can hear it now,
They
yes.
have come to believe that journalism should be telling them and affirming for them what they already believe. And if it's not doing that, then they're not telling the truth.
Instead of journalists writing facts and describing the facts in the news story, they interject their opinions. So as an example, say an article that refers to people that support abortion to be activists, and somebody that opposes abortion, they're anti, they have an anti-agenda against abortion.
Journalists are becoming more and more centralized in liberal areas of the country. As more and more journalists get laid off and centralization of news is pushing people into big cities, we are more likely to live in a place where progressive or liberal sensibility is the norm than we are to live in a place where conservative sensibilities are sort of the more accepted. People talk about the news very differently depending on where they live, and we are indeed out of touch as an industry in what happens in other parts of the country.
Until journalists recognize they have an image problem and they work to correct it, it's not going to be corrected. And I think how you correct it is by holding others in your own business accountable for what they do.
So it's about accountability, according to that gentleman. Rod will recognize the gentleman in the turquoise shirt as a participant in a program that he ran a couple of years ago called the Casper Project in Casper, Wyoming, where they brought, and Rod, I'll let you really talk about this in more detail, but they brought together people in one of the most conservative and least trusting areas of the country to talk about news and how news is produced, and see if you could try to perhaps get through to them with factual journalism. And at any rate, what you heard, I think, there was that terminology is triggering, right? And I think it must be difficult, as you know, the trend occurs that Joy Mayer was talking about, where journalists are tending to now centralize in more liberal areas of the country. The way you think about things, the way you talk about things, and you're used to talking about them in your circles and in your community, may not be perceived well in more conservative areas of the country. What do you all think about that?
I do remember Chuck Hawley quite well. He was one of the most active and talkative members of our group. I think he did a pretty good job summing up. We went to Wyoming about every 6 weeks for a session, talking to the same people. There were 36 people in Casper who participated. About half of them were identified as conservative, and the other half was a split between independent and Democratic, although there were more on the Democratic side. And so what we attempted to do is to listen to them to see where they were coming from about why they distrust the news, and also show them through different panelists and lecturers who came through. Lectures is probably too formal. Discussions, I'll say. People who came in and just talked about different issues that they had raised in a questionnaire that we gave them. They said that bias was the number one problem with mainstream news, although half of the group were very dedicated Fox News viewers. One of the things that Chuck Hawley said there is that he talked about how language can be loaded and create different impressions and show biases. He's right about that, but I don't think that he used a good example, because it's true that I worked at AP for 9 years, and in the AP style book, which, as you know, is used by many news organizations across the country, you may very well call somebody who is against abortion an activist, if that's what they are. But you would also use that term for somebody who is an activist who is who wants to keep abortion. So it may be his impression that those terms are used like that, and there may have been somewhere out there instances where it actually was, but that's not how AP recommends that we use it. And also, AP doesn't use the loaded terms that they use. We don't say pro-choice, for example. So it's because they come up with these terms that the terms themselves they want you to say over and over, and that's something that AP doesn't participate in to the extent that you can.
You know, I have heard over the years that the conservative side of the political spectrum is much better at coming up with terminology that either demonizes or valorizes whatever the issue is. I hadn't really thought about it until I heard a talk from George Lakoff, a linguist from, I think, Berkeley, University of California, who said that tax relief is a term that the Republican Party came up with to sort of demonize the whole idea of taxation. It's something it's not the price of living in a democracy. It is something you need to be relieved from whenever it's a burden, not a benefit of any sort. Anyone else want to weigh in on this? Anybody in the audience?
Well, I'm curious.
Meredith?
Well, I'd like to, am I muted?
No, we hear you.
Okay, good. I'm curious to hear more about that Casper project. And if Don, you were there for part of that, it sounds like, how long did that go on? And sounds very interesting.
I
Well,
was,
we're about 2 hours away from Don. He also is in Denver, right?
Yes,
that's
That
right.
area.
well, north of Denver.
So the Casper project was a 6-month project, and over those 6 months, I went to Casper about, like I said, every 6 weeks. We had a total of 5 sessions, 6 if you can include the one where after the report was out, I went back to share the report about our findings from the experiment. But it started, I think, in February. It ended in July, and then in October I went back with the book. We have you can get a copy of the report. It's also on our webpage. And the whole idea behind the Casper project was, well, twofold. We want to listen, and we did a lot of listening. And if you read the report, there are lots. Every one of them was recorded, and there's lots of information about what people said, and they raised a lot of good points. One of the things that Joy Mayer says, and this came up, and I walked away realizing that this is true, and that is that the issues that conservatives are most interested in are not reported on as much, or they're not reported on from a perspective that conservative audiences want to hear. I think that is true. And Joy Mayer, who is quoted in the report, says that we need to do a better job. It is no secret, this has been documented, that most journalists have a liberal ideology. Some feel more strongly about it than others. That's a fact. And so if you consider yourself a liberal, how difficult is it for you to step outside of that and see things from the perspective of a conservative, and then write stories in a way that they would focus on the issues, like take immigration, for example. I remember back when there were the kids in cages. You remember during the Trump administration, one of the things that we saw in the press a lot are all of these really sad stories about children being in cages. And, that's what we do. And it is, though they were very good stories, they put humanity in the stories of these kids and in immigration in general. But conservatives, they don't want to see kids in cages either, but they wanted to hear more about how you're going to fix the problem, and when are you going to feel as strongly as we do that this is an issue. And that's, and I think that was like a valid thing that they said. I mean, the stories, mainstream news did do some stories like that, but not nearly as many of the stories that go for emotion in my judgment.
Another thing that Joy Mayer said that is very true is there is a tendency of journalists to hang out with others who are like them. And especially in a large city like Denver. I mean, the contrast between Denver journalism and Wyoming journalism is not as much as it used to be when the Denver Post had a city room of 400 people, which now is smaller than the city room of Colorado Public Radio. But Kyle, where's 9 News now in the staffing of its city room?
my belief is that we have a staff that, so we're at about 100 staff members, which is pretty similar to the number to where we've been for the last 10 years or so. Certainly a lot of role shifting within that, a lot
Yeah.
of digital first and digital only roles, but still a staff of 100 people. And I think there might be one TV station in town that has more on-air folks than us. I'm not sure total staffing where they are. We're fairly close to CPR. So those are now the largest newsrooms in the state.
Yeah. And you're also larger than the Denver Post City, which I think is around 87, 90, somewhere in there. But anyway, there is quite a contrast. We had an SPJ event just Saturday for it's an awards program for good journalism in the Rocky Mountains. It's called Top of the Rockies. And I was surprised at how many Wyoming journalists were there. They're actually doing some pretty good work. And there is a difference, say, between Rock Springs, Wyoming, and Jackson Hole, or Jackson, Wyoming. Jackson is a much richer community than Rock Springs is, or even Casper. But the whole idea is that there's a huge conglomeration of journalists in Denver. And once you get outside of Denver, it's mostly rural and much more conservative. But Denver and the Front Range of Colorado are enough to drive the whole state of Colorado into the blue camp, more than the red camp. And speaking of which, Kyle, could you tell us a little bit about your experiences in calling attention to the bending of the truth that is a tendency among some, more of whom seem to be in the Republican Party than seem to be in the Democratic Party? And how do you go about doing that without increasing at least the conservative side of the public's perception that journalists are biased against them?
This is probably the wrong answer, but I don't concern myself very much with the perception. I concern myself with our actions and whether they comport to our ethical guidelines, and happy to have conversations with people about those. But if we were governed by perception, then we would just be reactionary all the time. And I think a lot of, perhaps some of what we see, maybe not a lot of, but some of what we see in the media is a reactionary to people working the ref all the time. What I'll tell viewers locally, and local journalists are accessible to viewers. That's the awesome thing about being a local journalist, is that you're in your community and you're accessible to your community. I tell folks that we try to apply a common standard, and you can disagree with where we've set the bar, where we've set the standard. That's a totally fair disagreement to have. Welcome feedback on that. But what I'm really particularly interested in is if we are not holding one person or organization to the standard that we've held somebody else to, because that indicates whether or not we're being fair about it. And often what you'll hear is, well, you ding the person I like for this, so now give me one from the other side. Well, that's of course not how it works. That's not how a referee calls a basketball game. That's not how any of this works. But I always ask people, do you have an example of somebody else of similar stature in Colorado doing that? I'll report on it tomorrow. And without fail, the answer is crickets, or some obfuscation. But that's what we tell folks. It's not going to be a whistle on one side and a whistle on the other side. We're going to apply a common standard. And where you get into trouble, I think where you're going with your question, Fred, is what happens when a person or organization makes violating that standard. Let's just say that the standard is honesty, or widely described decency, and makes violating that standard their brand and their calling card. And the situation that we've had most recently in Colorado is with Republican Representative Lauren Boebert of Western Colorado, who is very prolific at saying things that are not true. She's very prolific in saying hateful things about people, suggesting that a colleague who's Muslim is a suicide bomber, that kind of thing. And the question that we wrestled with privately in our newsroom, and I'm sure that other newsrooms have wrestled with privately, that I decided
turn into a public conversation through my program and a conversation with the audience is, how are we as journalists to cover that? Because I think there's some tendency, whereas cable is moth to a flame, they love her, they cover her all the time, they amplify her messages, she gains, even when they say it's not true. I think sometimes there's been a reaction in the local media to just say, well, we're not going to cover, we're not going to talk about her. But then that gives a pass to all of the indecent and untrue things that she says. And what I shared with the audience is, not only is it unfair to them as citizens and as voters, it's also unfair to anybody else who participates in public life and is held to a different standard than she is, because she has made a commodity out of indecency and lying. And, she gets a free pass because it's, her 17th false statement of the week, whereas we would hold the mayor of Denver's feet to the fire if it was his first one, or the governor for his first one or his second one. And that because she buys mistruth in bulk, she gets a discount from the media. And I didn't come forward with a solution. I came forward with a question about what's the best way to go about handling that from an ethical perspective. I mean, I think we saw the national media tested by it, and I'm not sure how well they acquitted themselves. I say sitting in judgment when I don't have the answer of how to deal with it either. They were tested by that during the Trump years, but now local journalists in Colorado have our turn. So how are we going to do it? Are we going to cover every lie? Are we going to ignore it? Does that incentivize it? How does that work? The intermediary step that we've taken is simply we point out the most egregious examples, but every single time point out the fact that this is part of a pattern, and that this is not an isolated incident, that this is what she does, and that it reminds us of this incident, this incident, and this incident, and so on and so forth. As Fred knows, because I've talked about this publicly as well, I was hoping to have a public conversation amongst journalists in Colorado about how to best cover politicians like that. And there was not much interest in having that conversation. There was no interest in having that conversation.
Yeah, it's kind of discouraging. Meredith, did you want to add something?
I was going to say, well, just a quick response there. If maybe at Media Fest this in Las Vegas, there would be more interest in politicians, a wider net with that. But actually, I just wanted to ask about blue and red versus local versus national, because it seems like covering local communities, there's less need for the political aspect of it, things that aren't blue or red, the schools, what's happening at the local government. So, I mean, I wondered if that came up with Casper or in your other stuff, Don.
That's a good point, Meredith. Although there certainly has been a lot of news lately about how politics have become more heated at the local level, particularly at the school board level. And Don, did you do, or maybe it was Rod who talked about that recently? You're on mute. Don?
There we go. I've been filming in newsrooms and at Colorado Community Media. They cover, Douglas County and some of the southern suburbs of Denver, where a lot of the school board meetings, I guess, have become very contentious. And while it's not really a Republican Democrat sort of thing, it's not a partisan set of issues. They do tend to get very heated, to be very heated discussions based on arguments that are put forth on cable news, right? So it takes on that sort of a partisanship, but it's not really directed by or at parties. There is an interesting statistic, actually lots of statistics over the last couple of years that show that local news is trusted much more than national news. And I think part of the reason is exactly what Kyle said, that, local journalists are much more accessible to the public, right? People are more apt to know someone in their community. But that also, is only in the more concentrated communities, right? When you get into rural areas, they're more likely to have lost their news outlets, their local papers. And so a lot of the same issues that people are already familiar with and are learning getting a deeper knowledge of through the local news are no longer reported on, right? So they're getting news from farther away that allows them to be more polarized as they would be, in national news coverage.
Well, let me
Let-
just tell you how
Yeah,
that has manifested in Wyoming. You may know, I know you guys from Colorado know, Wyoming has huge amounts of land, but it has only a handful of people. There are about 1 million people who live in the entire state of Wyoming. And so there's not, I don't know how many TV stations and newspapers still exist, but there are many news deserts in Wyoming. And the unfortunate thing that's filling the void is that you may not have a newspaper covering your area. There may not be a television station covering your area, but you can get conservative radio. And so conservative radio, with all of the conspiracy theories and all of the misinformation and disinformation, is a big chunk of the closest thing to news, what people there might consider news, that people are getting. They're not getting, there's nobody to cover their community. So there's no local news outlet. So they get to participate in these call-in shows. Some are local, some are national. And they listen to their conservative media because, Wyoming is one of the most conservative states in the country, which is why we went there. We went there because we wanted to talk to people who distrust the press. And as you know, conservatives are far more distrustful of what they term the mainstream media than the population as a whole. And Wyoming has the highest, this is from Gallup, says that they have the highest level of distrust of the media in the country. Now that's a 2018 stat, but it wouldn't surprise me if that's still true. So just think about the lack of diversity of information that the people there are getting, and it's information, it's conspiracy theories, and they think it's news.
well, this discussion kind of leads to our next clip, which is about what a relationship between a source and a reporter should be. And is it okay to help somebody? Or is it okay to, kind of step aside from your role as an impartial observer sometimes to do something in a more humanitarian realm? So Don, if you want to go ahead and play that one.
Yes.
It only lasts
Put it
about
up
a minute
better
and a half.
myself, so here you go.
The story that I'm working on longish term about the follow-up to the voucher thing, there's one source that I've been working with. He has a grandson who's in his 30s who has intellectual developmental disabilities. So he's on a voucher and gets a lot of assistance. So he's the one who reached out to me because he was like, you said discrimination is not allowed, but I'm experiencing it all the time trying to find a voucher for my grandson. So are you telling the truth, or are these people breaking the law? And so I've talked to him, and I've been talking to lots of housing experts about the law and about this new bill that's coming to try and fill the loopholes. But my question is about my relationship with that man as a source, because he's really trying to figure this out. He's trying to solve this so he can get a home for his grandson. So he'll call me and he keeps asking for my advice and well, what should I do? And is this legal? But we'll kind of reach this balance where when I've talked to a couple organizations and said if somebody thinks they're experiencing discrimination, what should they do? And they're like, they should call us. So I'm like, hey, you should call them. Right. So I've been playing that role and trying to help connect him to things because it feels problematic for me to know resources for him and not share them. But I also don't know if that's my role in the middle of it is all confusing because I'm using his story as a basis of how people are experiencing this discrimination. But he's also that story is continuing to evolve as I give him resources to help fight again.
Doing the right thing. If you know where you might go for help, why not?
Okay.
Why wouldn't you?
Why not? I think that's a good attitude to take. And As a matter of fact, Kyle has been doing this kind of thing, not exactly that directly, but every week he features a different nonprofit organization that's doing something for the community and encourages people to at least pay attention to it. Kyle, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And this is a great case study, and it's never really come up before a group of other journalists for an ethical conversation sometime. And I'm sure that I'd probably get reamed for this, but it would be a really fun conversation to have. So back during the lockdown portion of the pandemic, when everybody was stuck at home and kind of feeling really helpless, people were asking, how can we help with this? How can we help with that? So my evening local news program on the NBC affiliate here in Denver, Colorado, reaches most of the state, part of Wyoming, part of Nebraska. We started a weekly micro giving campaign. So a bit of a departure from what you would typically see on TV, where there's this long, heartrending piece about an organization that does work, and then at the end they say, and to learn more, go to this website or whatever. And and that's kind of your soft, like, if you've been so moved that you'd like to give them the money, then you can find it through this website, if you can write it down quickly enough and navigate your way to their donate button and everything else. And we thought, well, listen, maybe a more direct approach is what's called for in difficult times. So we started a weekly micro giving campaign with the idea that every week we profile a small to mid-sized nonprofit somewhere in the state, an organization that I've vetted for financial stability, leadership stability, program impact, that kind of thing. And then I just present a very direct summation of, this is what they do, here's why it matters. Would you consider giving $5 to support their mission, or this particular portion of their mission that they're going to earmark the funds for? And then the worst thing on TV is when somebody in a suit tells you to give your money to something. So I match the first 50 people who give our $5 to get it going every week. And we've been doing this for a while. Our 150th consecutive week is next week. So 150 causes around the state, in a lot of rural areas, even portions of the state that are not served by Denver TV. We've gone into, and the viewer response has just been enormous. People really crave that direct, how do I make an impact? How do I work with a trusted source in my community, a journalist who says, this is an organization that we can believe in and that we can give to. And with these $5 donations, our viewers have raised more than $10 million.
That's certainly something to be proud of, I think.
But it might cross a whole bunch of ethical lines, because again, I'm saying, these are organizations that I vetted, that I believe are doing good work.
Yeah.
That's to say that I couldn't make a mistake, that they couldn't deceive me. But I work hard every week to put somebody in front of them who is doing good work, and then I cross that line and say, hey, listen, I live here in the community, and I'm not a detached observer of what's happening. You know what I mean? I'm not going to be the journalist that refuses to turn on the garden hose at the house fire if it's within my power and I'm there. I'm going to turn on the garden hose.
Kyle, is the issue on that transparency and talking about how you chose that organization and what you did and why you're highlighting them?
We try to be direct with folks, with the fact that these organizations are selected by me and me alone. There's no input from our sales team. There's no input from our marketing team. I don't know if this has come up in the past, but our management team isn't even allowed to give me suggestions out of the thought that it might pressure me to select that organization. So all of the ideas come from viewers and people in the community. Occasionally another reporter will be out on a story and say, hey, I found out about this group. I'm not sure if they're a great fit, but if you want to check them out, I grabbed a number for you or whatever. Because I do think that there are some murky things that sometimes happen, especially in the world of local TV news, in terms of who's paying for exposure, who's not paying for exposure, how does that work? So we try to be clear with folks that there's no pay to play here. There's nobody directing me who to select. This is my best judgment of who's helping on the issues of the day.
This kind of reminds me of one of the case studies in the SPJ's journalism book, which is the role of doctors after a disaster, especially TV doctors who they're medical experts, and they're sent to an earthquake scene or something like that. how much loyalty do they have to their impartiality, and how much loyalty do they have to their Hippocratic oath? And I think in most cases, they say if they can help, they will. But I frankly, I think journalists should be more, not put their humanity totally aside and give people reason to hope, and not to approach everything as some sort of a hostile situation. Any comments from the audience? If you're having trouble getting through, you can email me, and but there is, if I'm told that if you raise your hand, I can call on you, but I haven't seen anyone raise a hand yet. So perhaps we should go to the next clip. Don, do you want to introduce that?
Seeing a hand raised. Jamie Bedrin's got a hand up.
Ah, there we are. Allowed to talk. Jamie, or is
Hi,
it Honey?
everybody. No, it's
Hi.
Jamie.
Okay,
I just wanted to comment on the just a tiny bit of what you were talking about with regards to I guess the advocacy, or looking out for your community when you're a journalist. One thing that struck me is I often share with my students in Montclair, New Jersey, something that I read about the journalist Alex Kotlowitz when he was writing a book. I believe there was this. He ended up. I think he may have created a trust for his sources. In one of his books, I guess he worked with children for like a 2-year period, and I'm sorry, you're hearing my family in the background. I apologize. But Alex wanted a way to give back in the most transparent way. So he created some kind of trust for this family, because he was essentially going to make money off of the stories that he was writing about them, right? He spent 2 years with them. I guess it was a Chicago family. And what gave me pause was that, whenever his book was written, I guess maybe 25 years ago at this point, it was just different. I mean, now that I think part of the issue is that it's all, so much of it is in our face constantly, right? That when there's loss, drama, harm, hurt, it's impossible to look the other way. Not that we should, but I'm curious what other people think. I just think it's just so difficult, right? I mean, and I wonder if he would have handled that situation in the same way today, or I thought it was a very smart approach, a very transparent way of saying, look, I know I may profit from this book. These were my sources. And I should have clarified by saying this came up when I would teach checkbook journalism, and I don't want to confuse the issue, but I'm going to mute myself again.
thanks, Jamie.
You're welcome.
Anyone want to respond? There were stories after not only earthquakes, but hurricanes, where journalists were helping to pull people from dangerous situations, or a case in which there was a very famous case in which a photojournalist eventually committed suicide when he took a picture of a starving child in Africa with a vulture in the background, apparently waiting. And he kicked himself from then on until he finally took his own life, that he hadn't done more to help that child. So I think for your own peace of mind, your own self-respect, but as a journalist too, that doesn't mean you're no longer a human being, and you need to remember that. Anyone else want to go to the next clip then?
Sure. So this next clip is really sort of continues where we started on the perceptions of bias. This is more about balanced reporting. And again, you'll recognize some characters from the Casper Project. So roll this now.
If you look at the content that does well in online channels, which is where a lot of people get their news, and it is that kind of like emotionally driven, impulse driven, like kind of identity driven and click driven kind of content, you can totally see why people would draw the conclusion that there's bias everywhere, because that's what, you know, that's what they're encountering in an online media environment on a day-to-day basis.
I think figuring out ways to make sure that stories are balanced, that they are fact-driven and not opinion-driven, is important right now.
I think it's really not what you report, it's what you don't report. It's when the stories are positive towards conservative ideas, they get buried or they get ignored.
So, you know, I think the interesting thing there is, you know, how does the audience know what your practices are for preventing bias? How do they know how you're selecting stories?
That's precisely what we attempted to do in Casper. We had somebody come in who specifically talked about bias, what it is and what it isn't. And you know, somebody in the group was complaining that some story that they felt like was really big, I think it was a national story, wasn't on the front page of the local paper. And what our guests told them is that one of the functions of local news is to give the people there the news that's important to them. And local newspapers focus more on local news because you're not going to get that anywhere else. There are a lot of places that you can get national news, but you're not going to get the local news. There are a lot fewer. And so if there's this big national story that a lot of other newspapers are playing up on the front page, there may be some local issue that's really important there. And so that story gets elevated in that local newspaper. And that's what you should be doing. You know, I think in the guy's example, the national story was on the front page, but it was down at the bottom of a page in a corner. And, you know, the guy explained that, you know, this isn't a national newspaper. We're telling you this, but our main interest is local. So a lot of people, the other thing that he pointed out, and I think that this is a good point, is that the bias goes two ways. We bring our own biases to the information that we consume. You know, we have some background, right? Who we are, you know, what motivates us, what interests us, you know, what bothers us. So we bring that to what we see. And as somebody said earlier, we want something that confirms what we're feeling. And so that's an important thing that people need to keep in mind. They also need to learn to distinguish news from opinion, because this is something that came very clear that people are very confused by that. One of the speakers, the same speaker said, he sent them an email. He said, before I get out there, send me a clip of a news story or something from the news, email me something that shows bias in your local media. Only a few people sent in something, but every piece that was sent in was labeled commentary, editorial, opinion, or something like that. So they don't know the difference. And some of the people who were saying that they know the difference between the opinion hosts on Fox and the news, they said that, but they listened to, and they constantly talked about, when we're trying to talk about news issues, they were constantly quoting Sean Hannity at that time in 2019. they're constantly quoting him, although they claim to know the difference between opinion and news. So we haven't done a good job as journalists of helping them to see the difference. And I swear these people were people who are probably bigger consumers of news and information than most people in Wyoming, and they couldn't tell. So you just think about just a typical person, trying to figure out what's what, and I swear they think that Fox News, because it has news in the name and because it says what they want to hear, they believe that that's news.
Meredith, in your effort to encourage journalists to seek a way to essentially certify themselves, what kind of pushback are you getting? Would there be a difference, say, between a news journalist and an opinion journalist? Or is that something, to me, and I've been both, I was an opinion journalist for half of my career. Both of them have to rely on factual information to report what the story is or to form an opinion on that story. So what kind of an approach are you taking? What is the main thing you want to emphasize for a journalist to seek self-certification?
Well, it really parallels the code of ethics, and there are several, actually there are hundreds of codes of ethics, but there are probably 4 key ones that are used the most, and the dominant being SPJs, which has been up in most of the newsrooms that I've gone to visit in the course of doing this. But absolutely, there is opinion journalism is legitimate journalism, but it needs to be clearly identified, and there's still confusion. And I think, to Rod's point, that there's a and this is the fault of journalists overall, or at least we play a big part in that, explaining what we do and why we do it and how we've done it, and then admitting when we're wrong. So these standards that exist, we are a very fragmented kind of thing. The First Amendment created all kinds of independent operations, but what we have is shared values and shared standards. Like, these things are parallel across legacy news organizations, professional news organizations. The advent of cable and opinion shows, it's a different beast, but the responsibility for accuracy is just as important in an opinion piece as anything else. So as long as that, you can't, just because somebody's standing up, allow them on your show to say completely false information and be a responsible journalist. It is your responsibility. And this is going to be true as AI comes on too, in a huge way. I mean, that the potential, I know we're doing a whole session on that later in the week, is enormous. The responsibility is on vetting and fact checking what gets out. So, so that's the key with what we're trying to do, is to point out that actually there are huge similarities among the news organizations in the country, and admitting, I want to say that again, and I'll stop. But when we're wrong, we say so, and we put it, we put it out there and fix it, because there are going to be mistakes. But we provide a really important function, and we need to remind folks what we do.
Yeah, accountability is key, I think, to the credibility of the news organization. But I want to ask both you and Rod, do you get a lot of questions from people who say, well, why is there not some sort of government certification system for journalists? Why do we not say this person is, define a journalist and then credential them and have an independent agency do that instead of an independent or have it done individually by journalists?
Well, what we're doing is moving very cautiously and just looking at what, like, almost pilot project type situation, but it's really clear it's the First Amendment, like the typical response is, oh, the First Amendment. But the First Amendment just is just about government. But the truth is, we did not in this country really need anything like that because the for-profit model worked really well for a really long time. In fact, I think 10 years ago, probably nobody on our advisory panel, including me, would have been advocating for some kind of through line. And things have changed. I mean, we have, especially young people, that's who we get the biggest response from. I mean, they are indistinguishable from influencers a lot of times. So even if you stay away from the crisis and drama and the conflict, is that who's doing what, do you take money from this one or that one? Are you been hired? Because we have a lot of cases of that where a company has hired what we used to be a marketer. Only what they've done is they have maybe 50,000 people on a Facebook page and they're promoting something that the city hall, the local paper is covering, but they're not covering the story. They're just promoting the one side. So just to make it clear who is doing what would be helpful, just at that basic level.
Yeah. Rod,
I do think that, I just wanted to say, I do think it's important to post, your code of ethics on your website. Many organizations do, but I think most news consumers don't know it's there.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, what I was going to say is I do get questions usually from members of the public about how we can deal with a journalist who has produced a segment or a story that they took exception to. They may say that it's inaccurate or I'm trying to think of an example. It just happened like probably 2 or 3 weeks ago. Had a good conversation with the guy and he's like, are you the guys who can pull this license? And I'm like, no, we don't really do that. And so, yeah, there are people who believe that there should be somebody policing journalists who can shut them down if they believe that they've done something unethical. But of course, there is the First Amendment. We are a country where you can freely express your views. And also, who is going to determine whether, what you consider to be horrible is really horrible by whatever standard somebody has set, and what is that standard going to be? So it just, I hear the frustration of people who do that, but some people, I've gotten emails like this. Some people just want to shut down information that they disagree with. It's not because the journalist did something bad. It's just that, how can they write this horrible stuff about somebody who I know or somebody who I like? You get that a lot.
I think we have time for one more clip. Anybody in the audience want to raise your hand with a comment, question? If not, this next one raises a point that I think is very interesting, and it may be counterintuitive about what people want from journalists. Don?
Right. Yeah. And I've heard Soledad O'Brien make comments in a couple of different places, one in her testimony before Congress, another on Jon Stewart's show, talking about how network journalists, not the journalists themselves, but the news organizations are very ratings driven. And so this is something that I think a lot of people think applies to all news. And it's really incumbent on a news organization to, I think, help their audience understand where they draw the line. And it sort of connects to a story selection as well. So here we go.
Our credibility is everything. And if we tried to tailor our message to what we thought the audience wanted, that wouldn't work. It would backfire against us. So what we do is we try to cover a story from all angles and all perspectives. And When we write a story or broadcast a story that somebody doesn't agree with, they let us know. So we might have a story, a climate story, for example, that looks at what are oil companies doing to try to mitigate their contribution to climate change. And we'll get complaints from people who say, why are you talking about the good thing oil companies are doing? They shouldn't, you should just be, talking about the bad things all the time. We do write about bad emissions from wells and when a refinery lets, poisonous gas loose into the air, we do cover those things. But if a company is doing something to actually mitigate, the damage, we're going to write about that as well. So what I think is people will in the end say, look, we trust CPR to be fair, and we're going to support that with our donations.
So
You
in
know-
their case, they're,
Go ahead, Doug.
concerned about donations because they are, listener supported. But, I think the challenge is for, commercial news outlets in general. And how does your audience know that, that you are being fair, that you have a diverse enough staff, diverse in terms of ideology or perspectives to choose the important stories of the day?
One of the thing that struck me about that comment from Kevin Dale is that I heard throughout my career that people complaining about the negative news they kept seeing in journalism. But apparently, if you give them positive news, they don't like that either. They want to hear why they should be angry instead of hearing that people are actually trying to solve problems. And it's probably because they don't trust the big corporations to be doing what they say they're doing to mitigate problems. But nonetheless, I think it is, if we were to ignore those efforts or to simply not simply treat them as if it's all hooey. I mean, if we can prove that they're not doing what they say they're doing, that's one thing. But I think we have an obligation to report it when there are problem solvers at work and they have actually come up with something that maybe works. Once again, it's that old give people reason for hope instead of just reason for hostility. Anyone else? Meredith?
Well, I think solutions that's a really important thing. I mean, if there's an inherent conflict of interest in that you need to draw viewers and controversy brings them in, then, we're going to be set up with the situation that those stories, those controversial stories, bring more people than solution stories. But that doesn't change the fact that it should be reported and make it interesting.
Yeah, I used to tell my journalism students while I was still teaching media ethics that don't forget that good news is news too. It's not all bad.
Can I just mention this? The sort of the flip side of that. Out in Wyoming, this is going to surprise probably no one. But out in Wyoming, again, this happened during Donald Trump, while Donald Trump was president. Several of the conservatives on the panel had a lot of complaints about the coverage of Donald Trump. By the way, Donald Trump came up every session, even the session that we did on local news where we had a local panelist, Donald Trump came up. And there are these several conservative members of the group who complained about the coverage of Donald Trump a lot, but what they were complaining about, they called it negative stories. Donald Trump did a lot of stuff, and the media covered this stuff, and they perceived it as being negative. But it's what the president is doing, and so it became clear that they did not want stories about what the president was doing if those stories were negative. And, it just blew my mind because anybody who I vote for, if they're in office doing something that's not in my interest or not in the interest of the constituents that they represent, I want to know that. And it just blew my mind that people said, don't tell me all this stuff about Donald Trump because it's negative. But it's what the president of the United States is doing.
Yes.
I might just add, for the folks who have determined that good news or solutions-based news doesn't draw an audience, I would be curious to know what resources they put into testing that hypothesis in a local newsroom, because we've done it, and it's been the most watched show in Colorado for 5 years. So we put resources behind testing the hypothesis. I would just be curious to know. Sure, market to market, it's different. Station to station, it's different. But we've got a test case, and it has drawn an audience. And then lastly, I would just say, Hui, that soundbite from Kevin Dale is really something. I mean, that's quite the soundbite. If we positively cover the oil companies' greenwashing, people will believe we're fair and will give us donations. I mean, that's entirely consistent with CPR's public policy, but to hear that said aloud was really something to behold. So congrats on getting that soundbite done.
Well, maybe it's an argument against public funding of struggling newspapers. Anyone else have anything you'd like to leave our audience with as a benediction?
I'd like
I
to
think
hear,
we've covered.
I would like to just to hear a recap of what's coming up this week.
Oh, okay. What's coming up this week is, let me get my notes here. On Wednesday, we will talk about what SPJ can do to improve and what its role has already been in trying to increase the public's trust in journalism. We have 3 panelists, all of whom, one of whom is a former SPJ president and now is the assistant director of Trusting News, another who is U.S. regional manager of the Journalism Trust Initiative, and a third who is CEO and founder of the Trust Project. So you may notice a word in common in all of those titles, as well as in the theme of this week. So that is Tuesday, that's Wednesday. And on Thursday, Eric Wishart, former executive editor-in-chief of Agence France Presse, more often known as AFP, will be leading a panel discussion of using generative artificial intelligence in the newsroom and how it can be a force for good or a force for sketchy ethics, in that it can write stuff as well as be an enormous aid to research. And then finally on Saturday, that program that led by Eric will be on Thursday. They're all at the same time, 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 Central, 5 Mountain, 4 Pacific, and 7 a.m. the next day in Hong Kong. And finally, on Saturday, we will have a closing session at which anyone who wants to ask a question about ethics or wants to complain to the ethics committee or tell us how swell we are, will be able to do that on Saturday. Same time, same location, sitting in front of your computers, staring at tiny boxes. So thanks again to everyone on our panel, and thanks to you who stayed with us and joined us for this evening's presentation. And I hope you can make it for, there also are local programs that you will find listed at #SPJ Ethics Week online. And there are, I believe, 2 local ethics programs listed there as well. So thank you again and good night.
Good night. Thanks.